Inflation is usually described as a problem, an unfortunate side effect, a temporary sickness in an otherwise healthy economy. Politicians say it is caused by shocks, by wars, by pandemics, by greedy corporations, by broken supply chains. Central banks say it is unexpected and transitory until it is not. Everyone talks about inflation as if it simply appears, like bad weather. But inflation is not an accident. It is a mechanism, a policy choice, and more importantly, it is one of the most efficient forms of taxation ever invented. Unlike income tax, inflation does not require a law. Unlike sales tax, it does not show up on a receipt. Unlike property tax, it does not arrive as a bill in the mail. No one ever votes for it, and no one ever explicitly approves it. And yet it extracts purchasing power from the population with remarkable efficiency. When governments need money, they have three basic options. They can tax, they can borrow, or they can create money. Taxation is visible and politically costly. Borrowing eventually hits limits because lenders demand higher interest when debt grows too large. Money creation, on the other hand, feels painless at first. No one's bank balance immediately goes down. No announcement says your money is now worth less. And that is exactly why it works. When new money is created, nothing tangible is produced. No new houses appear. No new food is grown. No new energy is generated. But there are suddenly more currency units chasing the same amount of goods and services. Prices rise not because businesses become greedier overnight, but because the measuring stick itself is shrinking. Inflation is not prices going up. It is money losing value. This is the key illusion. People blame the symptom instead of the cause. They complain about rent, groceries, fuel, tuition. They argue about corporate profits. But the silent force behind all of it is the expansion of the money supply. That expansion acts as a tax on anyone holding currency or fixed income. The mechanics are simple. If you earn $50,000 a year and prices rise 10%, you effectively took a 10% pay cut unless your salary increased by the same amount. If you saved $20,000 in cash, 10% inflation erased $2,000 of its real value in 1 year. No vote was taken. No law was passed. The loss simply happened. Historically, this tactic is ancient. Roman emperors reduced the silver content of coins to fund wars and public spending. The coins looked the same, but their purchasing power declined. Medieval kings clipped coins. Modern governments print. The method changes. The result does not. In the 20th century, inflation became institutionalized. After World War II, the United States emerged with enormous debt. Instead of repaying it through explicit taxation, policymakers allowed inflation to erode its real value. Between 1945 and 1955, inflation significantly reduced the burden of wartime debt. Savers paid the price. Debtors benefited. The state quietly won. The same playbook has been repeated again and again. In the 1970s, inflation in the U.S. averaged over 7% annually. Anyone holding cash or bonds lost massive purchasing power. Wages lagged behind prices. Meanwhile, asset holders saw nominal values rise, masking the underlying transfer. The most recent example is even clearer. Between 2020 and 2022, the U.S. expanded its money supply at the fastest pace in modern history. Trillions of dollars were created in response to the pandemic. At first, it felt like relief. Stimulus checks arrived. Markets soared. Asset prices exploded upward. Then inflation arrived. By 2022, consumer prices were rising at rates not seen in 40 years. A dollar in 2020 no longer bought a dollar's worth of goods. The purchasing power of savings collapsed. Again, no one framed this as a tax. But functionally, that is exactly what it was. Inflation works because it is opaque. A normal tax has a clear villain, a rate, a line item. Inflation has none. Responsibility is diffuse. Politicians blame central banks. Central banks blame external shocks. Corporations blame costs. The public blames each other. And because inflation is measured in averages, it hides its brutality. Official inflation numbers rarely capture lived reality. Housing, healthcare, education, and food often rise far faster than headline indices suggest. These are not optional expenses. They are the core of middle-class life. When they inflate, the tax becomes unavoidable. Another crucial feature of inflation as a tax is its regressivity. It does not hit everyone equally. Those with the least flexibility suffer the most. Someone living paycheck to paycheck cannot hedge inflation. Someone with no assets cannot escape it. Someone paid in fixed wages absorbs the full shock. In contrast, those closest to the creation of money are insulated. Governments pay debts with cheaper dollars. Financial institutions receive new money early, before prices fully adjust. Asset owners see nominal values rise. The system is not broken. It is operating exactly as designed. This is why inflation is politically useful. It allows states to spend beyond their means without immediate backlash. It funds wars, bailouts, and social programs without raising visible taxes. It transfers wealth without naming a transfer. And because the effects are delayed, blame arrives too late. By the time people feel the pain, the policy decisions that cause it are years in the past. Accountability dissolves. Inflation is often discussed as if it were a natural disaster. But natural disasters do not follow balance sheets. Inflation does. It follows deficits. It follows money creation. It follows incentives. Calling inflation a failure misses a point. For those in power, it is a feature, a silent, efficient, deniable tax, one that reshapes society without ever asking permission. Inflation does not hit everyone equally. That is the part that is almost never said out loud. It is discussed as a general rise in prices, as if society experiences it uniformly. But inflation is not democratic. It is targeted by structure, even if not by name. And the group it consistently damages the most is the middle class. The reason is not cultural or moral. It is mathematical. The middle class lives almost entirely on linear income, salary, wages, bonuses tied to hours worked or performance reviews. Even when incomes rise, they rise in steps once a year, sometimes less. Inflation, meanwhile, compounds continuously. Prices adjust in real time. Rent resets. Food reprices. Insurance premiums renew higher. By the time a raise arrives, the loss has already occurred. If inflation runs at 8% and your salary increases 4%, your standard of living fell 4%. On paper, you are doing better. In reality, you are poorer. This gap repeats year after year, quietly widening. Historically, wages almost always lag inflation. In the United States during the 1970s, inflation surged into double digits. Nominal wages rose, but real wages stagnated or declined. The same pattern reappeared after 2020. Between 2021 and 2023, real wages for many workers fell despite strong labor markets. The math is unforgiving. Prices move first. Wages react late. The middle class is also uniquely exposed because it holds its wealth in the worst possible form during inflation, cash and cash equivalents, savings accounts, checking balances, fixed income retirement plans. These feel safe. They are liquid. They are familiar. And they are slowly destroyed by inflation. At 2% inflation, the damage is subtle. At 6 to 8%, it becomes structural. Over 10 years, 7% inflation cuts purchasing power nearly in half. A family that saved diligently, avoided speculation, and followed every rule can wake up a decade later realizing that their savings buy far less security than they expected. This is not accidental. Cash is easy to tax through inflation precisely because it cannot defend itself. It does not reprice upward. It does not compound. It waits patiently while its value erodes. The wealthy do not hold much cash. The poor have little to lose. The middle class holds just enough to be vulnerable. Housing exposes this even more clearly. Homeownership is the central pillar of middle-class stability, but inflation transforms housing from shelter into a speculative asset. When money is cheap and abundant, real estate prices rise faster than wages. Those who already own benefit. Those who do not are locked out. In the United States, home prices rose dramatically after 2020. In many regions, prices increased 30 to 50% in just a few years. Mortgage rates later rose sharply, compounding the problem. The result was devastating for middle-class families trying to buy their first home. Monthly payments doubled even when prices stabilized. Inflation inflated both the asset and the cost of financing it. The middle class does not experience this as an abstract economic shift. It experiences it as delay. Delayed homeownership, delayed family formation, delayed stability. Life plans push further out of reach. Education follows the same pattern. Tuition rises faster than inflation almost everywhere. Why? Because when money is abundant, institutions can charge more and governments can subsidize more borrowing. Student loans are issued in nominal dollars. Inflation reduces their real value over time, benefiting the issuer and the borrower only if wages keep pace. For many graduates, they do not. Healthcare behaves similarly. It is price inelastic. You cannot opt out. Inflation raises premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs faster than wages. The middle class absorbs the shock because it earns too much to qualify for full assistance and too little to ignore the cost. What makes the middle class uniquely exposed is that it cannot escape into either extreme. It does not have the bargaining power of large asset holders, nor the safety nets sometimes available to the poorest. It is expected to absorb volatility quietly. Another structural disadvantage is taxation. Inflation pushes incomes into higher nominal brackets, even when real purchasing power does not increase. This phenomenon, known as bracket creep, raises effective tax rates without raising real income. Governments benefit twice, once through inflation itself, and again through higher nominal tax receipts. During periods of sustained inflation, tax revenues often rise even without policy changes. The state captures more resources while claiming fiscal responsibility. The middle class pays more while feeling poorer. Debt completes the picture. Middle class debt is typically consumer debt or mortgages acquired late, at higher prices. Wealthy borrowers take on leverage early, against appreciating assets. When inflation rises, debt denominated in fixed nominal terms becomes easier to repay if income or asset values rise with it. But middle-class incomes often do not keep up, while interest rates reset higher. Credit card rates adjust. Variable loans reprice. The debt becomes heavier, not lighter. This asymmetry is crucial. Inflation rewards those who borrowed heavily to acquire assets before prices rose. It punishes those who borrowed to maintain living standards after prices rose. Same mechanism, opposite outcomes. The psychological effect matters too. Inflation forces constant trade-offs, smaller portions, delayed purchases, substitutions. The middle class becomes hyper-aware of prices, even as it is told that the economy is strong. This creates distrust not just in institutions, but in the idea of progress itself. When every year requires running faster just to stay in place, effort feels disconnected from outcome. Productivity increases, yet security declines. This is not because people forgot how to work. It is because inflation quietly reassigns the rewards. Over time, this erosion changes behavior. People stop saving in cash. They speculate out of necessity. They take risks not to get rich, but to avoid falling behind. This increases fragility. When downturns arrive, the middle class absorbs losses again. Inflation is often defended as a necessary trade-off. A little pain now for stability later. But that framing ignores who pays the pain and who receives the stability. The middle class pays in lost purchasing power, delayed milestones, and eroded trust. And the most dangerous part is that it happens slowly. No single year feels catastrophic. It is the accumulation that breaks people. 10 small cuts feel invisible. Together, They change a life. This is why inflation works so well as a weapon. It does not provoke revolt. It provokes exhaustion. And once the middle class is weakened enough, the next question becomes unavoidable. If they are losing, then who is winning? Inflation does not simply punish. It also protects. And to understand why it persists despite its obvious damage, you have to follow the benefits. Inflation survives not because policymakers misunderstand its consequences, but because its consequences are uneven and, for a specific group, extremely favorable. The first group inflation protects is the state itself. Governments are the largest debtors in the economy. Their liabilities are denominated in nominal currency. When inflation rises, the real value of that debt falls. $1 trillion owed in 2020 is not the same burden in 2030 after years of elevated inflation. Without cutting spending or raising visible taxes, the state reduces what it owes in real terms. This is not theoretical. After World War II, U.S. federal debt exceeded 120% of GDP. Instead of austerity, policymakers allowed inflation and growth to do the work. By the mid-1950s, the real debt burden had fallen dramatically. Savers absorbed the loss. The government walked away lighter. Modern inflation plays the same role. Massive deficits that would be politically impossible to finance through taxation become manageable when currency loses value. Inflation is debt restructuring without negotiation. Central banks, despite their rhetoric of independence, are structurally aligned with this outcome. They exist to preserve system stability, not purchasing power in isolation. When forced to choose between financial collapse and inflation, inflation wins every time. It is quieter. The second protected group is the financial system. Banks, asset managers, and large financial institutions sit closest to money creation. New money does not enter the economy evenly. It flows first through government spending, bond markets, and financial channels. By the time it reaches wages and consumer prices, asset prices have already adjusted. This phenomenon, often called the Cantillon effect, explains why asset inflation precedes consumer inflation. Stocks, real estate, and bonds reprice upward before grocery bills do. Those holding assets benefit early. Those relying on wages feel pain later. During the post-2020 period, this pattern was stark. Equity markets surged. Housing prices exploded. Venture capital and speculative assets boomed. Only afterward did consumer inflation spike. By then, the wealth transfer had already occurred. Financial institutions also benefit because inflation increases nominal activity. More dollars move through the system. Fees, spreads, and commissions scale with nominal values. Even when real growth is weak, nominal growth can sustain profits. The third protected group is asset owners. Assets reprice with inflation. Real estate, equities, commodities, and even art tend to rise in nominal terms when currency weakens. This does not mean real wealth is always created, but it does mean that asset holders are shielded from the worst effects of inflation. A homeowner with a fixed-rate mortgage experiences inflation. As relief, monthly payments stay the same while wages and rents eventually rise. The real burden of the debt shrinks. The asset appreciates. This is not a flaw in the system. It is one of its strongest incentives. The same applies at scale. Corporations with pricing power can raise prices. Their revenues increase nominally. If costs lag, margins expand. Equity valuations adjust. Shareholders are protected. Inflation, in this sense, is not an enemy of capital. It is a filter. It rewards ownership over labor, leverage over saving, scale over dependence. The fourth protected group is anyone with the ability to borrow early and large. Inflation rewards debtors, specifically those who took on debt before inflation arrived. Borrowing at low fixed rates and repaying in depreciated currency is one of the oldest wealth-building strategies. When executed at scale, it becomes a systemic advantage. Large corporations issued cheap debt throughout the 2010s. Governments locked in long-term financing at historically low rates. Wealthy individuals leveraged assets aggressively. When inflation surged, The real value of those obligations collapsed. Contrast this with households forced to borrow later, at higher prices and higher rates. The mechanism is the same. The timing is everything. This is why inflation often widens inequality. It does not merely shift wealth upward. It shifts it toward those already positioned inside the system, those with access to credit, assets, and financial instruments. Another subtle protection inflation provides is political insulation. Because inflation's costs are diffuse and delayed, responsibility is hard to assign. No single law caused it. No single vote triggered it. It emerges from a series of necessary decisions. Emergency measures, temporary stimulus, unprecedented circumstances. By the time the consequences are felt, the architects are gone. Blame becomes abstract. Anger scatters. This protects institutions from direct accountability. Inflation also discourages resistance. When survival requires constant adjustment, people focus inward. They work more hours. They chase higher pay. They speculate. They do not organize around monetary policy. The complexity itself becomes a shield. Even the narrative around inflation protects power. It is framed as a trade-off, growth versus stability, jobs versus prices. Anyone questioning the system is accused of wanting recession, unemployment, or collapse. Inflation is presented as the lesser evil. But lesser for whom? When inflation is high, asset prices can fall in real terms and still rise nominally. This creates the illusion of prosperity. GDP grows. Stock indices recover. Headlines declare resilience. Meanwhile, real purchasing power erodes beneath the surface. This divergence between financial metrics and lived experience is not a bug. It is the environment inflation creates. One world looks stable on screens. The other feels increasingly precarious. Importantly, those protected by inflation are rarely visible as beneficiaries. There are no checks labeled inflation profit. Gains appear as market performance, asset appreciation, debt relief, or fiscal flexibility. Losses appear as higher prices, tighter budgets, and stress. This asymmetry shapes policy choices. When inflation rises, the debate is not whether it is acceptable, but how much is tolerable. The assumption is that some inflation is necessary. The question becomes who will bear it. And the answer is consistent. Those with assets are cushioned. Those with leverage are rewarded. Those with proximity to money creation are insulated, which leaves only one group unprotected. The group inflation ultimately sacrifices is the one least able to defend itself, those without assets, without leverage, and without proximity to power. This is not collateral damage. It is a final step of the mechanism. When inflation runs long enough, it stops being an economic phenomenon and becomes a social one. It reorganizes society by slowly separating those who own from those who only earn, those who can hedge from those who cannot, those who benefit from instability from those crushed by it. The first to be sacrificed are wage workers with no assets. Their labor is priced in nominal terms, but their lives are priced in real ones. Food, rent, transport, energy. Healthcare, none of these wait for annual raises or performance reviews. Prices move immediately. Income does not. For these workers, inflation is not an abstraction. It is skipped meals, smaller apartments, deferred medical care, longer commutes, second jobs. And unlike recessions, which are sharp and visible, inflation grinds slowly. There is no single moment of collapse, just a constant narrowing of options. The cruel irony is that these workers are often told inflation is happening because the economy is strong, employment is high, GDP is growing, markets are resilient. None of that translates into security. The metrics celebrate motion, not direction. Running faster in place still looks like growth. Those without assets also lack protection from shocks. When inflation forces people to spend a larger share of income on essentials, there is no buffer left. Any unexpected expense becomes a crisis. A car repair, a rent increase, a medical bill. Inflation turns normal life into a sequence of financial emergencies. Next come the young. Inflation hits generations unevenly and consistently disadvantages those who arrive later. Older generations often acquired assets before inflation accelerated homes at lower multiples of income, education at lower cost, debt at lower rates. Younger generations enter after prices have already adjusted upward. This is not about work ethic. It is about entry price. A house that costs 3 times income for one generation costs 6 or 8 times income for the next. Student debt burdens rise as tuition inflates faster than wages. Starting salaries lag behind living costs. The ladder is pulled upward, rung by rung. Inflation transforms time itself into a weapon. Those who are early benefit. Those who are late pay more for less. This creates a sense of betrayal that no political slogan can fully address. As inflation persists, family formation is delayed. Home ownership is postponed or abandoned. Children become a financial risk. Stability becomes a luxury. Societies age not because people do not want families, but because the economic floor keeps moving. Another group sacrificed is the prudent. People who save in cash, who avoid leverage, who follow traditional financial advice are punished most severely. Inflation rewards risk-taking and penalizes caution. It tells people retroactively that playing it safe was a mistake. This is one of inflation's most corrosive effects. It inverts moral signals. Speculation looks wise. Saving looks foolish. Debt looks strategic. Discipline looks naive. Over time, behavior adapts. People stop trusting money itself. They chase assets not because they understand them, but because standing still guarantees loss. This increases systemic fragility. When downturns arrive, losses are amplified. Inflation also sacrifices social cohesion. As purchasing power erodes, people search for explanations. Rarely do they land on monetary policy. Instead, they blame visible targets: immigrants, corporations, other workers, other generations. Inflation turns economic stress into cultural conflict. This fragmentation is not accidental. A divided population cannot coordinate resistance. While people argue over symptoms, the mechanism continues. Perhaps the most profound sacrifice inflation demands is faith. Faith that work leads to progress. Faith that saving leads to security. Faith that the system is neutral. When effort no longer maps to outcome, cynicism replaces trust. People disengage. They stop believing in long-term plans. They stop believing institutions are honest actors. This erosion is slow but deep. And yet, inflation persists. Why? Because inflation is not just tolerated by power, it is useful to it. It allows governments to promise more than they can deliver. It allows debts to be managed without default. It allows systems to survive without reform. Inflation buys time. Time for institutions. Time for balance sheets. Time for narratives. The cost of that time is paid by those least able to object. This is why inflation is a perfect weapon. It does not require force. It does not require censorship. It does not require repression. It works quietly, legally, and with plausible deniability. No single decision looks malicious. Each step is justified as necessary. Emergency spending, temporary stimulus, gradual accommodation. But together, they form a transfer of wealth and stability upward and inward. Inflation reshapes society without rewriting laws. It redraws class lines without announcing them. It disciplines populations not through fear, but through exhaustion. And because it never feels like a single event, it never triggers a single response. By the time people realize what's been taken, it is already gone. That is why inflation is not a failure of the system. It is one of its most reliable tools.